Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, whilst the imperfect progress made at COP26 is welcome, some of Africa's top priorities when it comes to getting support and policies to effectively tackle the climate emergency were not achieved. We take a look at what's now on the agenda, the road to COP27 to be held in Egypt next year. Also, the US Secretary of State heads to Africa on his first official trip. First stop, Kenya, but likely to be first on the list of issues to be discussed is Ethiopia's deepening conflict and fears that, if left unchecked, it could destabilise the region. And we meet some of the Central African entrepreneurs trying to ramp up industrial farming of cassava in the hopes of heading off the growing numbers of communities struggling to find enough to eat after supplies of the staple were disrupted by the pandemic. But first, few of the requests of African leaders made at COP26 were explicitly featured in the final text. Calls for drastically ramped up funding for adaptation to the ravages of climate change in developing countries and huge emission cuts from richer nations failed to make the cut, as did funding for loss and damage. More money has been promised to poorer countries, $500 billion by 2025, but the assist is short of the $1.3 trillion hoped for by African negotiators. For the first time, though, the COP agreement has specifically planned to reduce coal, with a deal struck with South Africa to decarbonise the continent's most industrialised economy. Earlier, I spoke to John Asafu Ajay, a senior fellow at the African Centre for Economic Transformation. I asked him for his takeaway from the final text of COP26.
Yes, so as you said, Georgia, we didn't get everything we're asking for, but I think there are some positives to take away. First of all, there's stronger ambition to reduce emissions, and the language is tougher than what we saw in COP21 in Paris. So it now talks about keeping emissions rise to 1.5 degrees centigrade, and Africa is one of the countries continents that will bear the brunt of climate change. So I think that's a positive. Also, you mentioned the financial assistance for mitigation and adaptation. Again, we did not get the figure that we had originally expected, but the text pledges financial support for both adaptation and mitigation. And importantly, it acknowledges greater support due to the increasing impacts of climate change and also COVID-19. So that in itself is quite positive. Again, there was an admission of loss and damage to developing countries, even though nothing has been agreed in terms of compensation. But that is something that could be pursued in future COPs. So overall, I mean, some will say it's a mixed bag, but I think overall it's quite positive because of these 3 points, in the sense that there's now clear commitment to reducing emissions to not more than 1.5 degrees centigrade.
Okay, so an optimistic outlook there from you, even though there is clearly still a ways to go. To be specific, though, how important is that commitment to phase out fossil fuel subsidies and reduce coal?
It's very important. Most African countries do not use coal, with the exception of South Africa. And also phasing out fossil fuel subsidies will be important. But what I want to point out, though, is that currently only 47% of Africans have access to electricity. So that's roughly about half the people living on the continent, which is around 500 million people. So in the short term, we would need to rely on oil and gas. And I think it's in order to increase access to electricity. But in the medium term, to achieve our targets, especially the targets in the nationally determined contributions, we would need to accelerate the transition to green energy as fast as possible. And that is where the promised financial support will be very important, because even though the price of renewables keep falling, they're still quite expensive for most African countries, and there's no technological know-how. So the money promise will be very important. But I need to point out that it's not only just about money. But African countries need technology transfer, they need knowledge transfer, and they need their capacities to be built.
So is that one of the things that you reckon will be a priority in the year to come? Because next year, for the first time, COP will actually be held in Africa. It's going to be in Egypt. Give us a bit of a sense about what you think will and should be done in the run-up to COP27 to try and really push African interests on these issues.
Yes. So before coming to that question, let me just quickly point out that the stakes are very high for African countries. For the past 2 years, there's been low-cost invasions in much of East Africa and some parts of West Africa. And just last week in my own home country of Ghana, there's been tidal waves, which has led to loss of death, livelihoods, and loss of property. So it's really very high for us in terms of bringing emissions down. Going into COP27, we need to do our homework to find out how we can actually access global climate finance. Because from the text, we see that international carbon markets are going to be very important in the coming years. But African countries need to be participants in these markets and not just bystanders. But currently, we need to build our capacity in various areas, like accurately measuring and reporting the green and blue carbon stocks that we have, improvement in forest governance, things to do with land tenure, secure property rights and land titles, which will help make it easy to get payments for climate finance.
In other news, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken headed to Kenya on Monday on his first official tour of Africa. Now, he'll be meeting with President Uhuru Kenyatta and likely trying to tackle regional crises in Sudan and Ethiopia. Caroline Kimio tells us more.
With Blinken's visit, hopes were high for discussions around a revitalized U.S. cooperation in Kenya and Africa more broadly. However, in East Africa, such discussions are likely to take a backseat to regional security concerns, including the escalating conflict in Ethiopia and the political crisis in Sudan. Now, America's diplomatic efforts in both countries have been largely unsuccessful. And with Kenya a strategic ally of the U.S. in the Horn of Africa region, the U.S. will likely be looking to Kenya to mediate some of these disputes, including, in particular, the Ethiopian conflict. Now, President Kenyatta was in Ethiopia ahead of his talks with Blinken, where he held closed-door meetings with Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and other senior officials. The details of the meeting are unknown. However, he likely urged his Ethiopian counterpart to work towards a peaceful resolution of the ongoing conflict. President Kenyatta is also set to attend an East Africa Leaders Bloc meeting on Tuesday to discuss the ongoing conflict in Ethiopia further. For Blinken, he will be going on to Nigeria after his time in Kenya, where he will meet with President Buhari and then conclude his visits in Africa with a visit to Dakar, Senegal, where he will meet President Macky Sall.
Caroline Kimio there for us. Now, international calls for a negotiated solution to the crisis in Ethiopia has yet to yield results. A year of war between Tigrayan rebels and the government's left thousands dead, displaced 2 million, unleashed the spectre of famine, and threatened stability across East Africa. Nicolas Chemin tells us more.
Tigrayan forces took control of 2 major cities in the Amhara region in recent days. Their leader, Debretsion Gebremichael, claims he could soon defeat government forces.
Our first goal is to destroy our enemy. The chances are slim, but this can be done through negotiations if the enemy comes forward peacefully. So we can destroy the enemy either peacefully or with force. We're using both possibilities, but most of the pressure is exerted with our military power.
The government recently rejected the idea that Tigrayan forces would be able to seize the capital, Addis Ababa.
It's been almost 2 weeks, I think, since the hysteria around Addis being under siege emerged, and yet we have seen that, Addis Ababans are going about their daily lives peacefully.
Some experts believe the Tigrayans' next step will not necessarily be to move towards the capital.
It looks like the Tigray leadership's next ambitions are either to try and take control of the Djibouti corridor, Ethiopia's main trade route, that would allow them to exert significant economic pressure on Addis Ababa and the federal government.
The war started a year ago. It has left thousands dead and displaced more than 2 million people. The international community is hoping there will be peace talks. The African Union said there was a small window of opportunity to end the fighting.
Well, South Africa's pulled its support for its candidate in the Miss Universe contest due to be held in Israel. Pretoria has withdrawn backing for Miss South Africa after the organisation refused to boycott the Miss Universe event amidst calls for a show of support for Palestinians. Pro-Palestinian organisations have been trying to convince Lalela Mswani to skip the pageant, as South Africa's long supported Palestinians and likened Israel's treatment of them to crimes committed under apartheid, an allegation that Israel has denied. Cassava is the staple food in Central African Republic, but it's become harder to come by during the pandemic. Currently, over half of Central Africans are thought to be struggling to get enough to eat. So some entrepreneurs are trying to ramp up cassava yields to tackle the problem. Our correspondents tell us more.
Sandy soil and daily rain make for perfect conditions for growing cassava in this field, located on the outskirts of the Central African capital. Joan is the manager of the first semi-industrial operation in the country. But because of the lack of budget for mechanical investments, the harvest is still done manually. To find the precious tuber, you have to dig up the cassava tree.
Un bébé bien potelé. C'est ça. Un gros bébé.
Joan just got back to the Central African Republic after studying agronomy in China. The young entrepreneur now wants to help his country achieve food autonomy, a tricky challenge.
We still have to import a massive amount, unfortunately. Our needs are estimated at 900,000 tons of cassava, but we can't even make half.
A few meters away from the field, his employees peel, cut and wash the cassava before drying it in the sun.
We harvest what we can and we keep the rest for the next day. We can produce 5 or 10 tons per week. That's already very good. While waiting for the machines, we try to do our best.
The flour for the dough and the leaves for the sauce are then put into packages, ready for use.
Voilà, alors là, nous le vendons sur le marché à 500 francs CFA.
It is higher than the market price, but the company claims better product quality. It also has the ambition to find new use for cassava.
C'est un veura.
Like turning the peelings into animal feed.
The goal is to reduce costs because corn is very expensive and cassava is full of energy. The animals like it. They're very fat, as you can see.
On the continent, cassava is the cheapest and easiest food to produce. Its intensive production could help offset the risk of famine in the Central African Republic.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Take care.